It is with great honor and extreme pleasure to welcome and introduce our beloved Sheikh Khalid Blankinship, the chair on religious affairs at the Temple University. He is a full professor there as well, and he is one of the luminary scholars of our greater Philadelphia area. Alhamdulillah, we are honored to have him here with us. And he will be presenting on the bloody and deep wound of our heart of the entire ummah, the current situation in Gaza and Palestine, that we as an entire ummah all around the world feel their deep uh, uh, and pain and suffering that they are going through, the unbearable calamities that they are witnessing unfold before our very eyes. Dr. Khalid is an expert historian in Islam as well, and he will enlighten us and illuminate for us, inshallah, the whole crisis and the history behind it all. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our Shaykh and turn it over to him. Jazakumullah khairan. فليتفضل مشكورا. جزاكم الله خير.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters in Islam, dear honored guests of whatever faith, I'm here to speak about the current war in Gaza and Palestine, which is a considerable catastrophe for the Palestinians and for others also in the world. And in order to do this, I will try to be as brief as possible, and I will try to hit the main points only about the situation of Gaza. I have a whole PowerPoint here with 66 slides that have a long discussion of Zionism and the entire problem of Palestine and how it arose and so on. But because of the interest of time and the difficulty of covering everything, I'm going to go just to the issue of Gaza by itself. And in doing that, I'm kind of leaving out a lot. And I apologize for that because one cannot say everything at once. And there's an awful lot to say about this on all kinds of sides and issues. And so now I will proceed. So first I have to do this here. Now, let's see. So the previous part of the PowerPoint discussed more of the West Bank, which has often been the main consideration. Of course, there are the three parts. The part of occupied by the state of Israel in 1949, which is considered Green Line Israel. And there's the West Bank, which is the bulk of the remaining Palestinian territory. And there is the Gaza Strip, which is about 1% of the land area of Palestine, a very small area, which is very densely populated and contains a very large percentage of the total Palestinian population. Not a third, but something on the order of 30% maybe. And that, despite the fact that these people are all crammed into that very small area. The Gaza Strip has a seacoast and borders Egypt, a very small border, and it's very densely populated, having a population variously estimated between 2.1 and 2.5 million residents. So I will just say 2.3 million, as some people say. And of these people, about 99.8% are Muslims and 0.2% are Christians. About 2,000 to 3,000 Christians inhabit the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian people are at least 6% Christian in all. So that means the percent of Christians in the Gaza Strip is way lower than in the other areas. Half of the population in the Gaza Strip are children, and over 60% of the Gazan population are refugees driven out by Israel in 1948 and their descendants. which means the refugee proportion of the population in the Gaza Strip is way higher than it is in the other parts of the Palestinian population, which include more than 2 million persons who have Israeli citizenship and inhabit more than 100 towns inside Green Line Israel, and the population of the West Bank, which inhabits maybe about 8 cities and 350 villages, and mostly consists of people who were original inhabitants of that area, although, of course, there is a proportion of refugee population there as well. The Gaza Strip, unlike the West Bank, was ruled by Egypt for a time, between 1948 and 1967, interrupted by an earlier Israeli occupation of a short duration after the Suez War. And then after 1967, since then, it has been under Israeli control and occupation. And during this time, Israel placed a few of its own settlements in the Gaza Strip in line with its policy of claiming the whole of Palestine for itself. So this is a map illustrating the Gaza Strip. I don't know if this has a pointer thingy in it. Yes, there it is. That will help. So this is the Gaza Strip over here, which is a very thin piece of land that's like only 3 miles across at the narrowest neck here. Here's a map of the city of Philadelphia inside the city limits on the same scale. The land area of Gaza is 141 square miles. The land area of Philadelphia is just over 134 square miles. So in other words, the square mileage of these two units of land is almost identical. It's very close. And the Gazan population, 2.3 million. Philadelphia has just under 1.6 million. So the Gaza Strip density of population is greater than the density inside the city limits of Philadelphia, which shows that it can be construed as entirely an urban area, even though, of course, it has some areas of sand dunes and so on, so it's not all inhabited. But then we have here in Philadelphia, Fairmount Park, and we have the old oil refinery and area and stuff. So Philadelphia has some uninhabited areas also. That is just a size comparison, and a very telling one, because here we are in Philadelphia, and it shows how very small this area is in the whole world scheme of things, very tiny. This is another map illustrating exactly the same thing, but here I put the population densities respectively, so you can see the Gaza population density over 16,000 people per square mile, contrasting with Philadelphia's something like 11,000 people per square mile. Here is a map made in 1991 showing the Gaza Strip during the Israeli colonization, and these blue splotches indicate the areas that were settled by Israeli settlements. So this land here was taken up by Israeli settlements, and some thousands of Israeli settlers were settled in it. The idea mainly was to illustrate that Israel was going to claim any land for settlement. It also settled in Egypt until 1982, when the Israeli settlers were removed from Egypt because of the peace treaty with Egypt. And so the idea of settling the Gaza Strip by Israel was an attempt to show that it was treating it the same as the rest of the territories, like in the West Bank. However, Israel has never had much interest actually in settling in the Gaza Strip because it's just too densely populated with the Palestinians there. And this is a view from Wikipedia showing Gaza City in 2009. And this must be one of the nicer neighborhoods in Gaza City, so that you can see a neighborhood of buildings and so on there. And this is what's being destroyed now, but not for the first time. So Gaza was placed under the Palestinian Authority in accordance with the Oslo Accords in 1994, which was an attempt that was made to establish a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And of course, the whole idea that there's been this settlement of Palestine, Israel is a settler state, they came in and settled in the land of someone else, and eventually forcefully drove out a lot of the native population and appropriated their land. In what is called Israel's original sin in 1948, Israel drove out 750,000 Palestinians, which was over half of the Palestinian population, and depopulated 12 cities and 400 villages, which was the great exodus of the Palestinians at that time. And then Israel appropriated their land and in most cases did not allow the Palestinians to come back, except for a very few persons. And the driving out of the Palestinians led to a series of wars, at first with the Arab states, in which the Arab states were unsuccessful and in which Israel was able to expand further in 1967, conquering the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights from Syria. And those also remain, all of them, problematic in one way or another, even though Sinai was returned to Egypt eventually. So the Israelis in 2005, owing to Palestinian resistance in the Strip to occupation, withdrew their forces and the settlers. But they kept control over all access to Gaza by land, sea, and air to the area. In the following year, 2006, the Hamas party, or Hamas movement, won the Palestinian elections by gaining a plurality of 42.9% of the vote, which gave them a majority in the assembly. And then Fatah, the previous leading Palestinian organization, made a coalition with them to rule. And so they had a kind of coalition government for a period of less than a year. And then in 2007, the coalition broke down and the strife led to Hamas retaining control of the Gaza Strip and Fatah of the West Bank. Now, in the West Bank, the territory is completely surrounded by Israel and still under Israeli control, and the Israeli settlers have strongly desired to expel all of the population from the West Bank and seize all of that property. In the Gaza Strip, that was not the case. Israel actually withdrew from it because it didn't see that as something that was worth it. It wasn't worth the effort and the strife and the struggle to try to displace these many people who have been increasing up and now are 2.3 million people. So that was why Israel withdrew from there. The rule of the Gaza Strip by Hamas was used by Israel as a reason to continuously attack the Gaza Strip since that time. And nothing about this struggle can be seen without seeing this as part of the context. So this is the list of the wars. In 2008, 2009, during 22 days, the Israelis killed so many Palestinians, up to 1,400, and 13 Israelis were killed in addition, and 50,000 Gazans were rendered homeless at that time. In 2012, in 7 days, some Palestinians were killed as well, between 160 and 170, and 6 Israelis. In 2014, in the action of 49 days, more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed and 72 Israelis, with 18,000 Palestinian homes destroyed, which probably would render, again, 50,000 or more people homeless. And the Great March of Return, when the Palestinians made demonstrations on the border of Gaza with Israel, the Israelis killed 223 Palestinians. In 2021, in the Israel-Palestine crisis that was caused in Jerusalem because of the argument over property in Jerusalem, and also affected the West Bank. On the Gaza front alone, 256 Palestinians and 15 Israelis were killed and 72,000 rendered homeless. So the destruction of civilian housing in the Gaza Strip, that's nothing new. That's something that's been done repeatedly before by Israel. And furthermore, the Palestinians of Gaza have been perfectly aware that that is what Israel would do in case that they made some kind of massive resistance, such as they did. And obviously that is going to elicit a violent Israeli response. And this is the assessment of the damage, I believe, in 2014 Israeli campaign against Gaza, and all of these bomb spots show where they bombed. And it's notable that the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which is more heavily inhabited, was bombed more, that the central area of Gaza City was not attacked quite as much, that Khan Yunis, the second town in the strip, or city in the strip, was not damaged as much, and that areas along the edge were kind of blasted away by the Israelis. That huge damage was done nevertheless during that. This is a picture of Rafah in 2014, I believe, which shows the damage to some buildings. You can find lots of pictures on the internet. I have minimized that here because I'm not talking about that specifically. Then I have a series of maps that illustrate other things that Israel did. After 2007, they imposed a zone around the Gaza Strip, this blue zone, which is part of the Gaza territory, that is called the security zone, and that prevents access by the Palestinians to about 30% of their agricultural area, and Israelis shoot anybody that tries to go in it. There aren't Israeli troops in that area, or at least there were not. And they also established a sea blockade where they would not let the Palestinian fishermen go beyond a certain line, which might even be that red line there on the sea. On that side, Israel destroyed the Palestinian airport in 2001. And anyhow, it established a complete blockade of Gaza on all sides. This is the main issue. The Israeli blockade of Gaza, before anything else, is the issue, because the blockade has been extremely harsh. From the Israelis' side, they say that oh, well, we have to prevent any materials that could be used for warfare from arriving, but they also restrict the caloric diet of the Palestinians to so many calories per day, which is reminiscent of what Nazi Germany did to the concentration camp inmates in World War II during the concentration camps of that time. The border with Egypt also has remained closed, as Egypt has cooperated with Israel in closing off the border with the Palestinians. That has had some interesting consequences for Egypt. For the Palestinians, of course, it means that they are completely surrounded. Originally, Israel had intended to keep the border here under its control, the border with Egypt, but it made an agreement with Egypt that Egypt would do this policing for it, and Egypt has upheld its side of the bargain for the most part up till now. So that makes the Palestinians in Gaza, in effect, prisoners in the largest concentration camp ever devised by the human race, and the longest lasting, or one of the longest lasting. And this is just another map of it, as I collect maps and I stick them in my PowerPoints, and then it's a convenient place to store them because then I know where they are. So these are different maps of the Gaza Strip. This one, for example, shows the more or less built up areas, and that is where the people actually live, because the people live generally in apartment houses and not in individual, separate, detached houses like people in the United States. People in the Arab and Muslim world largely live in apartment houses. In urban settings, they mainly live in apartment houses. That would be true of Cairo, it's true of Amman, it's true of Beirut, and so on. So that means a larger density of population. And even though a person might think, oh, well, I don't want to give up my individual, separate, detached house, but someday it may be out of efficiency for energy use and so on necessary to do that. And the building of apartment house communities might be more efficient in some ways. Anyhow, that's how people live. This is a more recent map. It's a very good one, although you can't see the details because it's too small, but you can find this on Wikipedia, I believe. And it's from this year, I think. It says September 2023, so it's brand new and has a lot of figures on it and so on, and you can blow it up when you look at it. It gives you a lot of details. Also, it has the built-up areas updated, so you can see the built-up areas have spread in the Gaza Strip to cover more of it, just as everywhere else in the world, the same movement is going on, where built-up areas are spreading all over the world and covering all of the land. And this, of course, is a huge environmental problem for the human race, which is going to have some kind of resolution in the future. The fact is that the human race this is kind of an aside that isn't on this subject, but the human race in 1900, 123 years ago, all of the structures that the humans had built weighed about 3% of the biomass of the earth, the weight of all living things. Today, all the human structures that have been built weigh 120% of the biomass. In other words, the structures have increased about 40 times in weight in 123 years, more than 40 times in weight. So the horizontal spread of structures is a huge problem. And of course, in a crowded area like the Gaza Strip, you can see now it's getting pretty solidly built up, actually. So to turn to the assault itself and the subject that we're actually here for, and go away from the background, the assault by the Gazans on Israel, which is not just an assault of Hamas, because you hear a lot of discourse of Hamas this and Hamas that and Hamas terrorists, blah, blah, and so on. But the fact is that there's a long history of war here. And however you want to define terrorism, which is normally a term of abuse used against the other, in which a person doesn't call themselves that either. So therefore, it's a term of abuse. Just like fundamentalist is also a term of abuse. And so one needs to identify these terms of abuse and to challenge people who try to use them. And of course, as has often been observed, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter and so on. And in this case, the Israelis call the Palestinians terrorists, and the Palestinians and a lot of others call the Israelis back terrorists. And that doesn't really help any. It's just sort of like saying, curse you. And it is a non-informational form of discourse. Yes, there's violence, and that is troubling. And the violence is terrible and really ugly if you get down to the nitty-gritty of the details of it. But call it terrorism, call it what you want, it's not going to change anything. It is what it is. Anyway, the attack was surprising because it never happened, ever, that the Palestinians in Gaza went out and made an attack. That's just unprecedented. They never made an attack like that. That just didn't happen, period, ever. I mean, if one thinks about the whole history of it, it never, ever happened. If you go back to, that is, they didn't make an offensive where they crossed the border into the territory that is Green Line Israel. That never happened. Of course, they had shot rockets off before, and there were plenty of incidents, and Israel used those as a reason to retaliate. And so the cycle of retaliation went on, and both sides were fuming at each other, cursing each other, and so on. And as you saw from the so-called wars that I illustrated before, which I called Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip, mostly it was the Palestinians who were being killed at a rate of at least 20 to 1 and sometimes 100 to 1 and stuff like that. So the Palestinians were really at a disadvantage. Clearly an actual offensive of this kind that was very unprecedented. Nothing like that ever happened before. So that was very surprising. And it was obviously well planned and carried out in a way that was quite successful in a couple of respects. Because one also has to ask, if Israel is armed with nuclear weapons and armed with all these arms and able to defeat and destroy the Gazans, and why ever would the Gazans go on such a suicidal attack? Why would they do such a thing? Because it would seem counterproductive. And already, even after a few days, the loss of Palestinian life is greater than the loss of Israeli life. And that's very unsurprising, considering that the Israelis have all the weapons, all the firepower, control of the air, that they bomb Gaza from the air, as they have done before over the years many times, without getting any of their planes shot down, and so on. The idea is, why would this happen? And that is a very good question. And it's something that I have a hard time even wrapping my head around, because it's so difficult to imagine. All I can imagine is the simplest explanation, which would be that the Gazans, being surrounded and besieged for so many years and seeing the world ignoring them, decided that they would just go for broke and that they would not care about the consequences. They decided that they would not care about all of their nice buildings and so on, and whatever they had in the Gaza Strip, because they were basically in a state where they were being strangled by Israel that had its hand around their neck in any case all the time. In other words, they were very closely monitored, controlled, and so on. And in that sense, it's kind of a revolt of desperation. That's what I would look at it as. I would look at it as they saying that, well, I don't think my life matters. I just want this to come out. And so I think that's what they did. And they certainly wanted to break the frozen situation they were in, where they were under this prison situation, where they were practically imprisoned by Israel from the outside. And they did succeed in breaking the frozen situation, because this is going to have massive, if unpredictable, consequences. The consequences of it haven't been seen yet, and they're going to go far beyond the Gazan Palestinians. And what will happen is kind of unpredictable, and I will get to that presently. And so the Israelis have suffered, according to the latest reports that I saw, over 1,400 dead and still counting, which is comparable to the loss of life of the Israelis in the October War of 1973, when Egypt and Syria made a war against Israel, also a surprise attack, in which about 2,400 Israelis were killed by the end of the war. So if 1,400 have already been killed by the Palestinians of Gaza, who don't even have an army, who are just militia, who don't have any advanced weapons, who have no SAM rockets and no tanks and no super weapons and no organized armies, then this is almost incredible. It's almost unexplicable how that could be. It goes beyond what could be explained in any sense, in any rational way. And other people also thinking this. So a lot of people have thought, well, this is all an Israeli plot. The Israelis plotted this so that they can get at the Palestinians and drive them out. Okay, but when was it ever in the history of Israel that it needed an excuse to drive out the Palestinians? It could make any small excuse or use any small attack as an excuse to do anything. And for the Israelis to accept some catastrophe for themselves on this scale, that's just not possible. It's not possible. And especially, it isn't possible for the Netanyahu government, which is certainly going to face being ousted after it gets blamed by the population over this. And we have already heard that families of the dead Israelis are demonstrating that Netanyahu be ousted right now. It is not possible for the Shin Bet and the Israeli Secret Service and so on, who are the Israeli intelligence, who have all the information and had all the spies and all the ability to know what was going on, to get out of this, because they are going to get blamed very severely by the Israeli public. Therefore, it's absolutely not possible that they plotted something like that. That's beyond belief. At the very, very most, it's conceivable that the Israeli secret police or intelligence services might have had some inkling that something was going to happen and that they were alarmed about it for one reason or another. Or they thought that, oh, well, that would just give us an excuse to bash Gaza again. But the scale of this, no, they wouldn't have possibly welcomed any of that. That simply isn't the case. And it has also been the case that the Israeli government and others on their side have been very careful about not killing their own population. And the idea that they would just accept killing their own population in such a way, no, not possible. And so that is something that I would have to discount. So the Palestinians claim that the civilians were not targeted, but that's probably only partly true. And so some reports made that were exaggerated propaganda about babies being killed and so forth. But on the other hand, the fact that civilians were killed in some of these places, or settlers, or whatever you like to call them, who were not armed people, that seems to be likely enough. However, given the history of Israeli massacres of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, this is not a surprising development, even if it is reprehensible, because it is just that type of thing. It's just that kind of war that has gotten to the level where people do that, and people do not discern between one side, between one kind of person on the other side and another. Like, this is military, this is civilian, they just don't discern that. The Palestinians shot off over 5,000 rockets and appear to have also some anti-tank and short-range anti-aircraft weapons even. How did they get that? This is just difficult to imagine how many of that stuff could have gotten into the Gaza Strip. It's sort of beyond belief, because here they've had this siege for all these years. And so I find that very hard to wrap my head around or understand how any of that could happen. And there were long-range incursions of considerable depth into Israel, as well as killing of inhabitants of a couple of Israeli agricultural settlements, and at least 130 Israelis were captured and taken back to the Gaza Strip, including military personnel. So this is one map that I found illustrating the Israel-Hamas war. In this case, this is the area of Palestinian penetration. That is, the red dotted line illustrates how far the Palestinians got into Israel. And it was recorded that they reached this town of Ofakim, they reached Netivot, they reached Sderot, and so on. And actually, they also reached Ashkelon, but this particular map doesn't show that. And then this is the area that the Israelis evacuated all their people from as this was happening, because this is not a line that a Palestinian army came in and held. Rather, it was just raiders went out into this area in a scattered fashion. So the Palestinians didn't actually hold any territory. And this then shows, as of the time the map was made, these purple areas showing areas of Palestinian presence where the Palestinians may have made perhaps more of a stand. That's one map. Then this is the other map showing the same thing. Here it's harder to see the dotted line, which indicates the Palestinians' maximum penetration. I believe this is Ofakim. And so this shows that they also poured over and almost got to the Israeli Arab town of Rahat here, Raq in Arabic, which is a city that the Israelis built or allowed to be built for the Bedouins of southern Israel. And it actually is a large city, like has 60,000 people. So that is a Bedouin city. And that illustrates also some of the complexities of what we deal with here. This map shows that the Palestinians have continued to hold on to some areas that were adjacent to the Gaza Strip as of that date. So that showed the maximum penetration of areas. Oh, and this map also shows they reached Ascalon here, or Ashkelon. Now, here is some examination of the Israeli dilemmas. So for the first time against an enemy, Israel in the 2006 war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which many of you will remember, Israel lost the war. And that was the first time they lost the war. They didn't claim to have lost the war, but they lost it, and they lost it badly. That was because they could not stop the rain of rockets on Israel by Hezbollah from Lebanon. And they were unable to exhaust the supply of rockets that Hezbollah had, which was very large, and continued to exist with many rockets that they hadn't even shot off yet. And they could not destroy the launching sites of the rockets despite their control of the sky. This was a massive military failure of Israel. Israel was also unwilling or unable to invade Lebanon again for some reason. This is a big mystery. In the past, the Israelis always invaded any place that they were opposed from and attacked ferociously everywhere. But in this case, they did not actually enter Lebanon, or rather they tried to enter Lebanon a little bit in a couple of places and were repulsed and gave up and didn't try any further. Why that is a mystery. It is not known. Some people might say, oh, well, the Israelis now are afraid of casualties, so they didn't want to go into a war where they lose a lot of people. That's possible. Alternatively, it's possible that the United States decreed that they not do that and that they leave the border as it was and that they accept a ceasefire even without a victory. The US has constantly attempted during and after this to disarm Hezbollah from Lebanon, to form a Lebanese government that would get rid of Hezbollah or ban it, and so on. And that labors against the fact that in Lebanon, the Lebanese Shia, who are the supporters of Hezbollah and who almost universally support Hezbollah, are as much as 45% of the population, and they're certainly not less than 40% of the population of Lebanon. And because of this large Shia percentage of Lebanon, it's very hard for any the Shias are poorly represented in the Lebanese parliament, which continues to have 55 Christians and 55 Muslims and Druzes down to this day, where the Muslims and Druzes are underrepresented and the Christians are overrepresented because the Christian population is not more than 40%, and according to some estimates might be as small as 23% of Lebanon. And so, nevertheless, the Christian politicians have to represent the others in Lebanon, such as the Shias in their districts as well. And so they come under pressure from that. And the other thing is that a substantial portion of the Maronites who formerly dominated Lebanon have allied themselves with Hezbollah, as have the Druzes, and therefore they completely checkmated the United States. Unfortunately, the Lebanese Sunnis have been very anti-Hezbollah and have been the main supporters of the United States side in that strife. But it's been a complete failure, and so they haven't been able to get Hezbollah that way either. Of course, Israel took some revenge by bombing so that more Lebanese were killed than Israelis were killed in the war, and they could say, well, we did all right at that point. But their failure to smash Hezbollah, to block Hezbollah, to end Hezbollah was just a complete, total defeat. The reason they could accept that defeat, however, was that Hezbollah was outside of Israel, and that Hezbollah was not threatening to invade Israel, to cross the border into Galilee, into Palestine. Hezbollah did not threaten to do that. Hezbollah were simply trying to keep the Israelis out of Lebanon, and their whole idea was, you stay out of our country, you'll stay out of yours. So that would be something that Israel then could eat. So Israel had to eat their defeat and to just let it go. And after that, they don't like to talk much about it, obviously, because it was a huge humiliation for them. But now, when the Palestinians of Gaza do something similar, it is much more unacceptable, because those are Palestinians, not Lebanese, because those are in the same territory, because the Palestinians don't regard the issue of the territory and the boundaries as finally settled, because the Gazans consist 60% of people who were ejected from those very territories that they just invaded in the southern part of mainline Israel. And so as a result of that, they can't allow that. But there's a bigger reason that they can't allow this and that they can't eat it. And that is that the Israelis believe that they have to show superiority over the Palestinians, because if they let that go, then they will be under the gun and they will be subjected to, and their whole thing, their whole project will be threatened by that. And so to the Israelis, this is an existential struggle also. That is something that needs well to be recognized. And so they can't give in on it. And then also they don't want to give in to a wronged Palestinian population of Gaza, who have been suffering from this historical wrong of their expulsion for a period of over 70 years, and then all the violence that has accompanied it and has come on after that, which has been increasing and increasing over time, that to have this population on their doorstep and not be under their control is just intolerable. And that has led some of them to becoming hysterically fanatical. But others, especially most of the leadership, look at it in more terms of realpolitik, of real political reality, and try to not get carried away with it emotionally too much, in order that they may figure out how their state can survive. So far, what Israel has done, as far as I know, looking at the latest news that I saw, and I must say I'm not looking at it too closely because it's too painful to look at, but so far they have a demand that the Gazans evacuate the Gaza City and the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Gaza City is the largest city in the whole land of Palestine, that is, including Israel. It's larger than Tel Aviv, it's larger than Jerusalem, it's larger than Haifa in population, and certainly way larger than Nablus, the main city of the West Bank. So to ask that the whole population of the city leave, that's quite an extreme demand, after all. Now, they are said to leave the northern part of the Gaza Strip. So they didn't say to leave the Gaza Strip entirely, and that's the point we'll get to presently. So another feature of it is that an Israeli military campaign against the population will be very difficult. And so the fact that the area is rubbleized, that is reduced to rubble, actually makes it less penetrable by Israeli forces because they can't use their mechanized forces, their tanks and their vehicles and so on, since the streets will all be filled with the wreckage of collapsed buildings. And the Russian war in Chechnya, the wars in Chechnya, where the city of Grozny was completely rebelized, illustrated this point very well. And it's agreed to by military experts that the rebelization of a city makes conquering it more difficult. So in effect, their bombing actually makes their own program of invading more difficult. And that is what they say they propose to do, but it remains to be seen what will exactly happen. Now, possible outcomes could be this list. And these are all different, and none of them are anything that I'm, necessarily favoring over others as the more likely or anything like that, but we can consider each of them. So first of all, the wholesale genocide, the idea of completely exterminating the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, is something that obviously Israeli politicians talk about, and it's also been supported and suggested by Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, the two evil Republican senators. And Joe Biden has said some equivalent things about this too that suggest to me that he also was supporting that, which of course would be extremely wicked if it were some state's policy to openly support something like that, because the whole world is watching, and the damage that would be done to the United States by that would be far greater than the damage done by any of the other choices on this list. So I think that that is unlikely, but it is possible, it is certain that there would be a very high amount of death among the Palestinians. And if the Israelis demand 20 to 1 killed Palestinians at least, then you would have to say that they would demand about 30,000 Palestinians be killed. And at some point, they may come to feel that it's enough, but we'll see about that. Then there is the proposal of the United States, especially to expel the Gazans into Egypt and to eliminate the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip by pushing them out into Egypt. And this is something that's being discussed, and something which also, however, has a certain problem to it. And while the US prefers that solution, Israel may not prefer it for certain reasons I will get to presently. Thirdly, maybe Israel will just conquer Gaza and occupy it again. That is certainly a possibility. However, it would be very costly for them because they would face continuous resistance, and they already gave up on that view of things once before in 2005. So coming back to the same place to them would be a terrible thing. And to restore the previous conditions, the status quo ante, meaning the previous situation, is also not something that is attractive to them, although it's conceivable that that could be the outcome as well. Then there's also the possibility that Israel might actually fail to conquer Gaza. And that because the amount of loss of life that they would face would just be too much. And also, Israel has limited time, because the more time goes on, the more Israel is going to be despised and hated for this around the world, and there will be more international pressure on it to stop. So that means if it's going to do anything, it has to do it fast, and it's unfortunately for it not being able to react fast in this case. With regard to expulsion into Egypt, first of all, Egypt, its president, its deep state, and its public completely reject this idea. They've already stated that they rejected the idea. They refused to open a corridor for Palestinians to exit from the Gaza Strip when Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, asked them to do that. That was completely refused. Furthermore, Egypt is in an absolute froth over this. And if any of you have Egyptian relatives you've been talking to, You will know that since my wife is Egyptian, of course, we've been talking to them, and my brother-in-law in Cairo, for example, and they're all in a complete froth about this and very deeply concerned about the loss of territory in northeast Sinai that would come about from that. So if the Gazans were driven into northeast Sinai, they would still be on the border of Israel. It's true they would be a few miles farther away than they were before from some of the Israeli towns and so on. But with modern weaponry, that would not be very effective. And so having a big group of Palestinians on their border, that won't help them. And the other thing is, the Gaza Strip they had quite under control, but the Palestinians being driven over the border into Egypt would not be under their control anymore. And that would be a huge downside for Israel in this. For that reason, Israel may not be enthusiastic actually to drive the Gazans out of the Gaza Strip because it would lose control over them. And this would be a very serious problem for it. Also, forcing the Gazans into Egypt would be an act of war against Egypt and would constitute a unilateral abrogation of the 1977 peace negotiated with, the 1977 visit of Sadat and the peace that was eventually after that negotiated in 1979 with Israel, that it would lead to a potential state of war with Egypt. In Egypt, the Gazans' presence might destabilize the Egyptian government, and the other thing is that it would lead to the possibility of a tenfold revival of the Sinai natives' rebellion against the Egyptian state. It has been an amazing fact also of the last few years, another one of the many, many things that I found a hard time wrapping my head around and I can't understand, that this huge revolt of a few 100,000 people, or maybe 200,000 people living between Al Arish and the border of the Gaza Strip broke out against Egypt, and it led to things like the massacre of over 300 people in the mosque at Bir al-Abd, and things like that, this huge upheaval happened against Egypt coming from the tribes there. These are people who are pastoralists and therefore are called Bedouins sometimes. And today, of course, they're more settled than pastoralists. They're more settled in towns and so on than they are pastoralists. But they're a very small population of a couple of 100,000 people. Why on earth would these people rebel against the Egyptian state this way? And that's true that the Egyptian state always, treated them disrespectfully and, tended to push them around somewhat. But why would they revolt? Like the Awlad Ali on the other side of Egypt toward Libya, who are also Arabs of the same type, they didn't revolt. Why would the people up there revolt? It's because they were already politicized because of having been driven out by the Israelis in the period 1949 to 1955, when Israel drove out 69,000 Bedouins from the southern desert of Israel into Egypt and Jordan. I've never been able to find what the number that went to Jordan and the number that went to Egypt was. I couldn't discover that. But they were driven out into those two countries, and they often belonged to the same tribes that also existed across the border, because these were people that had fairly large areas that they would herd their animals in. And they're driving out an exclusion from the south of Israel was a grievance that was added to by the Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula from 1967 to 1982. And so the rebellion, in my view, must be somehow connected with the connection of those people with the Palestinians, and the arrival of the Gazans there with a much larger population, many times larger, would simply constitute a massive threat to the country of Egypt, and threaten to actually cause them to lose control over that territory. So if the Gazans arrived in Egypt, Egypt would have to seek to distribute them across the world. And since no country will take a single Gazan at all, for sure, they would have to go like boat people. They could go from Libya or from Egypt directly to Europe, for example. And everywhere those people went, they would be a now liberated but aggrieved population against Israel. So is that what Israel really wants? See, Israel is really stuck here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. So here's the border with Israel, and there's the Gaza Strip up there. And the area we're speaking of is just this little triangle up there. That's where the war of the natives against the Egyptian government took place between Al Arish, which is that black dot right there, and going through Sheikh Zayed, which is unfortunately not on the map, which is another town there, up to Rafah, which is also an Egyptian, Palestinian and Egyptian city, or a city that has components on both sides of the frontier. That little area where it might be proposed to dump the people is already then a seeded area, and this is very problematic for Egypt, of course. And some people said really stupid stuff like, oh, maybe they could bribe President Sisi to accept the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. First of all, Sisi, even though he is an autocratic ruler, a military ruler, and so on, and is not really tremendously popular at this point, is nevertheless not going to do that by his own lights, because he is, after all, an Egyptian Muslim. He's just not going to do that even by himself. Besides that, he has all the pressure from the Egyptian military, the Egyptian deep state, the Egyptian elite, and the general Egyptian public to put up with, all of whom are completely opposed to this idea. So it's a universal, united idea they would never accept. This map illustrates the agricultural area here, where you can see, maybe you can't see from the seats, but there are a little bit of green here illustrates the fields and the cultivated areas up there that have enough rainfall to be cultivated for various crops. And also in Wadi al-Arish, there is a kind of an oasis there. Whereas most of Sinai, northern Sinai, is just a big desert with sand dunes and barren rocks. And anyhow, that's the illustration of that part. So the only people in the world who are on board with Israel, right or wrong, is US and its shrinking list of allies. The rest of the world are against it. And this is also then hardening the line between the United States and the rest of the world, where the US power has already shockingly decreased. The reason for that being the hollowing out of the US economy by finance capitalism, the export of US industry to other countries, and the gradual impoverishment of the US population, which is about to get worse, which has extremely alienated the masses of the American people, so that they simply want to, so there's a very vast proportion of the American public that would vote for Trump for president now against Biden. And that, in spite of the entire propaganda of the mainstream media against Trump, which is absolutely thorough, that nevertheless in the polls, Trump is running neck and neck with Biden. In some polls he's ahead, in some polls he's behind, but it's always like a difference of 1% or something, which is in the area of uncertainty. And this is just the whole idea of the public to annoy the elite in the country, and certainly it threatens disorder inside the United States itself. And so this current issue doesn't help that at all, even though most of the American public obviously do not care about Palestine or the Palestinians particularly, but nonetheless, this whole issue just simply adds to that. And then there are the people who do care about the Israeli abuse of the Palestinians. So in spite of being discouraged by the governments, they have opposition. So you have demonstrations in France that tried to ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and in Britain, and also in the United States. And as I was speaking about, the loss of legitimacy of Western neoliberalism is ongoing and added to by these actions. And then the conflict could conceivably spread. The United States moved to try to dampen that down and prevent the spread of the conflict by specifically stating that the CIA had found that the Iranian leadership was shocked and surprised by the Palestinian attack. And that in order to head off the neocons who always want to bomb Iran. And in fact, it seems likely that they are stopping and preventing that. And it may be that Israel itself also does not want that, because maybe they have enough going on. It's also not necessarily likely that Israel wants to provoke Hezbollah into another war with it, because then what? If Hezbollah can just rain down missiles on Israel continuously, and Israel can't stop them, then what can they do? So this is a map of the countries that recognize the state of Palestine as of before this conflict broke out. And you can see, with a few exceptions, all that do not recognize Palestine are the US countries, which are the same ones that have followed the boycott of Russia owing to the Ukraine war. US, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, the countries called the Five Eyes, referring to the cooperation of their intelligence services, the five English-speaking countries, the Anglosphere. That is an alliance of countries which are in this together. The European Union, most of it, although curiously, all those strongly anti-Russian Eastern European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania, in addition to the Western European country of Sweden and also Iceland, which is a NATO country, they all recognize Palestine as well, so they even broke ranks with the alliance against Russia. And also, in addition, Japan and South Korea, which are allied with the United States, and Taiwan. That's it. And that's the whole of US alliances anymore. The US doesn't have alliances beyond that. It has not been able to impose its will on other states to boycott Russia or to impose sanctions on Russia. And this is an unprecedented defeat for US foreign policy. And it definitely shows the way that things are going. The world is largely united against the United States on this point. Now, lastly, one has to admit that Israel is caught between a rock and a hard place. No outcome of this will be beneficial to them. And one may sympathize with the Israelis over their loss of life too, and the injuries they have suffered, even if it's far less than the injuries and killing that they have inflicted on the Palestinians. And if one studies the whole history of Zionism in Israel to see how we've gotten to this point, one will understand how, oh, that went off, sorry. Well, anyway, one will understand how the, what the reason for the Israelis' behavior is. They follow nationalist logic, like other places follow nationalist logic. The trouble was they had no territory that they could claim for themselves, because every place they were only a minority. So in order to claim a territory for themselves, they had to clear out some place for themselves. It was too late because of colonialism ending to do that, because it was so late in the colonial era. The time had passed for that. There are 6 successful settler states that exist in the world of European colonial settlement. Does anyone want to tell me what they are? United States, Australia,
Canada,
Canada,
New Zealand,
Japan.
no, not a settler state.
New Zealand,
New Zealand, the other two you won't get though, because they're unexpected. Argentina and Uruguay. Argentina and Uruguay are European settler states that wiped out the indigenous inhabitants just the same as the United States. The other South American countries are all mixed countries. Those two countries are largely white. In fact, they're whiter than the US is. And that's it. All of those settler states succeeded because they started way long ago and had hundreds of years to build up their settlements when it was okay to push around other people and take their land, and it was okay to wipe out Aboriginal people. The other thing is that the Palestinians were not Aboriginal people. The Palestinians were a civilized people, part of a civilization with a dense population. So not only was it too late to go and wipe out Aboriginal people, but they were trying to settle in the midst of civilized people, and that simply didn't work. There were other European attempts to make settler states that all failed. Those include, of course, obviously, South Africa as the primary example. But they include, in addition, the settlement in Kenya. And when the British settled in Kenya, their first idea was to keep it for themselves. And the British in southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and the Germans in Southwest Africa, which became Namibia, the Portuguese in Angola. In every one of those places, there was an attempt to put Europeans in that would outnumber the natives and overtake them. And it was all too late, too little, too late, and it all failed. And of course, in the Arab world, the French in Algeria and the Italians in Libya tried to do the very same thing. The Italians, under Mussolini, took the whole population of eastern Libya and put them in concentration camps. That whole eastern Libya area, Barqa in Arabic or Cyrenaica in English, that has Derna in it, the city that was recently destroyed or partly destroyed by a flood. That whole area, they took the entire population and put them in concentration camps in order to try to cow them. And that's very parallel to what's going on here. And so all of those attempts failed. They were too late, they were failures. And so the Zionists are faced with that. And then they think, well, what else can we do? And furthermore, they and their ancestors came out of the cauldron of nationalism in Eastern Europe, where we see the fanaticism of the Ukrainian nationalists now, which is matched by the Polish nationalists, who are completely fanatical, even though they have their ethno-state that was given to them by Stalin, ethnically cleansing all the Germans out of it and expanding their territory. And are they thankful to Stalin? Oh no, he wasn't the Pole. So the people who have this have nationalist logic that they think by, and it's too bad. But it's not just the Israelis. Zionism is very unexceptional as an ideology. The trouble with Zionism is not that it's Jewish. The trouble with Zionism is that it has no Judaism in it at all. It's not Jewish. Only Jewish part of it is the window dressing of, we have a Star of David on the flag and so on, and we do these rituals, etc. And we have these holy places, and they make a show of that. But where are their hearts really? It's invested in the state of idolatry, which is the case of all nationalism. And it's equivalent to all nationalism. And all nationalism is just as murderous in the end. It's just that their circumstances have them trapped. And so this is the problem that they have. And to find a way out, they have to change. And that doesn't look like that's going to be easy. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry, I probably spoke for too long. Anyway.